The lights were blinding, the air electric. Two icons, one from the courtroom, the other from Congress, sat just feet apart, but generations and ideologies apart. Judge Judy, the queen of televised justice, pointed a finger across the CNN stage and said what millions never expected to hear. "You may talk fast, but you don't understand justice." The room went still. The audience held its breath. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. She simply answered with one sentence that turned the studio upside down, left Judge Judy speechless, and made millions rethink everything they thought they knew about power, legacy, and what justice really means. This story may be fictional, but the emotions it taps into are very real. The clash of voices, the silence that followed, and the questions it raises, those belong to all of us. The lights inside CNN Studio 7 weren't just bright, they were surgical. Cool, clinical, and mercilessly white, they revealed everything and spared no one. Every wrinkle, every glance, every shift in posture. It wasn't a set, it was a pressure cooker disguised as a stage. The town hall special, Justice in America, What Needs to Change, was already trending on Twitter before the countdown even hit 0. People expected a civil discourse, maybe some political theater. What they didn't expect was the kind of heat that would burn its way into history. The camera panned across the sleek, semicircular stage. At the center, two chairs, one draped in familiarity, legacy, and 20 years of syndicated authority. The other, leaner, almost understated, like it was made not to fit in, but to challenge everything around it. The first to walk out was Judge Judy Sheindlin. The crowd, mostly older, many grew up with her voice echoing through weekday afternoons, rose to its feet. The applause was warm but sharp, like a sharp suit freshly pressed. Her gait was confident, deliberate. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. Judge Judy didn't enter the room. She took custody of it. Wearing a dark navy blazer with crisp white cuffs peeking out, her posture was straight as a gavel. She nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the crowd like a monarch. The lights bounced off her silver hair like it had been choreographed. And then came the second entrance. No fanfare, no wave of nostalgia, no cue cards needed. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC. She walked in like the moment didn't belong to her, but she knew it would. Her suit wasn't designer, charcoal gray, tailored but practical. No earrings, no dramatics. Just the quiet armor of someone who had walked into rooms colder than this and left them lit. The audience didn't erupt. They leaned forward, and the camera, hungry for narrative, immediately caught the eyes. Not blinking, not scanning, but focused, like a surgeon preparing for something delicate and irreversible. Her eyes didn't say, "I'm here to argue." They said, "I've already seen the outcome, and I'm just waiting for you to catch up." Anderson Cooper, ever the polished mediator, offered introductions. He called them two American icons representing two visions of justice. But everyone in the room could feel it. This wasn't just about vision. It was about collision. Judge Judy adjusted her chair before sitting, a subtle power move. AOC didn't flinch. She sat with her spine upright, hands folded, not in tension, but in control. From the first seconds, there was a silence between them that buzzed louder than the applause. And then it began. A single, simple question from Cooper. "Tonight we ask, is justice in America broken, or is it simply misunderstood?" A soft murmur in the crowd. Judy straightened her collar. AOC tilted her head, not smug, not defensive, curious, like she was examining not just the question, but the weight of how it's been answered, decade after decade, by people who never had to ask it from the outside. Even before either woman spoke, something had cracked in the room. You could sense it, that this wouldn't be about facts versus feelings. This would be about whose reality gets to define justice, and whose pain gets edited out of it. And somewhere, even before the first word was spoken, millions watching at home could feel it. One of them would walk away with the last word, but maybe not the one you'd expect. Judge Judy was the first to speak. She didn't waste time warming up or softening her tone. Her voice cut clean through the stillness of the studio, polished by decades of delivering verdicts. Justice, she said, isn't about feelings or fads. It's about choices. You make good ones, you avoid trouble. You make bad ones, you face consequences. That's how society stays intact. Her gaze scanned the room like she was still behind a bench. Personal responsibility, she added, isn't optional. It's the foundation of order. Some audience members nodded instinctively, the way people do when they hear something that sounds right, even if they've never stopped to ask who the rules were written for. A few even clapped. Judy didn't look at AOC once. She didn't need to. Her entire statement was delivered like a warning across the table. AOC didn't react. No smile, no raised eyebrow. She simply looked down at her notepad and wrote something slowly, like she was carving a thought into memory. She nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. And that gesture, quiet as it was, shifted the energy. Anderson Cooper turned to the audience, inviting questions. A young man in the second row, maybe 22, wearing a college sweatshirt, stood up. His voice was steady, but his question had weight. I study criminal justice, he said, and I wanted to ask about sentencing disparities, especially when it comes to drug charges. Why does it seem like two people can do the same thing, but one ends up in jail and the other goes home? Judge Judy adjusted her mic, ready to respond, but Cooper turned to AOC. Congresswoman? AOC leaned forward slightly. Her voice was calm, but her posture had shifted. She wasn't here to win a debate. She was here to be precise. We don't just have a broken system, she began. We have a calibrated one. Calibrated to produce predictable outcomes, ones that disproportionately target Black and brown communities, while offering exit ramps to others. She paused to let that land. Mandatory minimums for crack cocaine were once 100 times harsher than powder cocaine. The only difference? One was used in poorer communities and one in wealthier ones. No anger in her tone, just measured fact. She glanced down at her notes, then back at the audience. In 2022, Black Americans made up about 12% of the population, but accounted for nearly 30% of all drug-related arrests. And that's not because they use more, it's because they're watched more. A ripple went through the audience. Not loud, but unmistakable. Judge Judy stiffened. She looked as if she wanted to interject, but AOC wasn't finished. Justice doesn't begin at the courtroom, she said. It begins at which neighborhoods get police funding, which schools get mental health counselors instead of metal detectors. It begins when one kid gets a warning and another gets a record that follows them forever. The young man who asked the question nodded. Others followed, and then came the sentence, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't tremble, but leaves a mark. If fairness were colorblind, statistics wouldn't see so much color. For a moment, no one spoke. Judge Judy looked like she had just tasted something bitter, not because it was false, but because it was true, and she hadn't expected it to come wrapped so calmly, so cleanly, and with that kind of weight. AOC didn't smile. She just turned the page in her notebook. The room and the story had quietly shifted hands. The silence didn't last long. Judge Judy leaned in, her tone sharp like glass under pressure. That's the problem with your generation, she said, chin tilted slightly. You come armed with theories, studies, and hashtags. But I've lived in the courtroom. I don't deal in theories. I deal in consequences. A few people in the audience nodded. Those who'd grown up watching her gavel fall like thunder, who'd come to equate firmness with fairness. But something in the air had shifted. The applause didn't come this time. Instead, the camera cut to AOC. Her hand rested gently on the armrest. Open, not clenched. No shaking, no scribbling. Just stillness. Controlled, quiet stillness. The kind that signals someone is thinking not of how to fight back, but how to finish a point you never saw coming. And then she smiled. Not big, not performative. Just a subtle curve that suggested more than it revealed. It wasn't the smile of someone about to retaliate. It was the smile of someone who'd heard this before, many times, and had already outgrown the need to shout over it. She didn't raise her voice when she responded. If anything, it dropped lower, forcing the room to lean in. Consequences without context, she said slowly, don't produce justice. They produce cruelty. The words hung in the air like fog, not loud but impossible to ignore. She didn't stop there. See, we love to talk about consequences, but we rarely ask, consequences for whom? And consequences from what starting point? Because there's a difference between a choice and a corner. Judge Judy opened her mouth, but the audience was already watching AOC with a different kind of attention. Not just out of curiosity, but out of recognition. Recognition that she wasn't debating anymore. She was describing what many had lived, but few had ever said on a stage like this. There are people in this country, AOC continued, who make a single mistake and it follows them forever. And there are others, her eyes met Judy's, who make many and find redemption printed on a second chance. Judy crossed her arms. So we let them go. No consequences for bad behavior. AOC didn't blink. We start by asking why the behavior happened and whether the system ever gave them a path that didn't lead straight to punishment. A slow hush fell over the audience, not because they were bored, but because they were calculating what had just been said, because they knew on some level that it wasn't just theoretical. Anderson Cooper tried to interject, perhaps to balance the exchange, but his voice was softer now too, like even he knew the moment didn't need narration. It needed space. Judge Judy leaned back slightly, her jaw set, but she didn't interrupt again. Not yet. The control she was used to commanding wasn't responding the way it used to. She had thrown the first match, but the burn hadn't landed. Instead, AOC had handed the fire back, with a question behind every word. And behind that question, a truth no gavel could silence. The studio lights remained just as bright, but for the first time they weren't just illuminating two women, they were revealing two versions of what justice meant, and one of them had just started to look less certain. The flash wasn't in AOC's tone, it was in her calm, and the room wasn't just listening now, it was watching her, closely. As Judge Judy sat upright beneath the studio lights, arms folded like verdicts yet to be spoken, AOC let her mind drift, not out of distraction, but into memory, into a place far from sound stages and televised town halls, a place where justice didn't come with applause or edited reactions. It was a corner bodega in the Bronx. Fluorescent lights, chipped tiles, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator that never quite kept things cold. She was 9. Her father stood at the register with a gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, and a single box of cereal. His card didn't swipe the first time, or the second. The cashier didn't say anything cruel, just looked at him the way systems often do. Not angry, just impatient, like he was taking up too much space. That look stayed with her. So did the way her father apologized, not just to the clerk, but almost to her, as if needing food was something shameful, as if surviving had somehow become a burden others had to carry. At school, AOC learned to speak quickly, think sharply, and listen harder than the boys who interrupted her. But the lessons that mattered didn't come from textbooks. They came from watching her mother leave for work before sunrise to clean buildings others wouldn't touch. They came from counting coins to catch the subway, from holding in frustration when classmates assumed her family was on assistance, as if that was a weakness instead of a system working exactly as it was designed. By the time she was 16, she had already seen the gap, wide and quiet, between what people said America was and what it actually felt like, depending on your zip code. She saw friends stopped and searched for walking home with a hoodie, while others skipped court dates and called it youth. So when Judge Judy talked about consequences, AOC didn't flinch. She had seen consequences, not from courtrooms, but from credit checks, from bus passes that expired too soon, from guidance counselors who said, maybe community college is more your lane, without even asking what she wanted. Justice to her was never about the sentencing. It was about the sorting that came before it. She stared past the cameras now, not looking at Judy, but through the words she represented, not with resentment, but with clarity. Because the truth is, AOC didn't come to this town hall to prove herself. She came because she knew what it felt like to have people speak over you and call it law, to grow up with your back against a wall and be told the wall was there to protect you. And yet, she made it, not because the system lifted her up, but because she learned to navigate it sideways, to move like water, to find cracks and pour through. That's why her voice was steady now. That's why her answers carried weight, not volume. The mic had changed, but the memory hadn't. In her mind, she could still see her father sliding the card one more time. And she remembered what that taught her, that dignity isn't given in courtrooms. It's either preserved or stripped in the spaces before judgment even begins. And somewhere beneath the hot lights of CNN, she could hear her own voice forming a thought. Not for the audience, not even for Judy, but for herself. They said work hard and you'll make it. I did both. What changed was the mic I got to hold. And tonight she intended to use it, not to shout, but to name what had always been there, waiting to be said out loud. There's no denying Judge Judy's impact. By numbers alone, her legacy is carved into American pop culture, like initials on courtroom wood. Over 20,000 cases, more than 2 decades of dominating daytime television. At her peak, she was pulling in $47 million a year, making her the highest paid person on TV. Not actor, not anchor, judge, a robe, a gavel, a smirk. For millions, that was justice. She was sharp, fast, brutal when she wanted to be, and viewers loved it. They didn't just tune in for rulings, they tuned in for takedowns, for the stare downs, for the lines that cut like razors. Don't pee on my leg and tell me it's raining. It wasn't just TV, it was American catharsis. The courtroom distilled into something snackable, instant verdicts, no deliberation, no gray zones, just cause and consequence, delivered between commercial breaks. For a long time that worked. In a country obsessed with order and individual responsibility, Judy wasn't a judge. She was a myth. The myth that if you were loud enough, sure enough, and unbothered by nuance, you'd be right. But tonight, under the lights of a live town hall, there were no editors, no retakes, no audience laugh track. The stakes weren't ratings. The stakes were relevance. And for the first time in a long time, Judy wasn't facing a defendant. She was facing a question, one she hadn't rehearsed for. It wasn't shouted. It didn't come wrapped in rebellion. It was quieter than she was used to, and far more dangerous, because it didn't accuse her of doing something wrong. It asked whether the things she'd always called right might have only felt that way from her side of the bench. The thing about legacy is, it hardens with time, like cement. And Judy's had been drying for decades, but AOC didn't walk in to destroy it. That wasn't her style. She walked in with something Judy hadn't encountered often, someone who didn't flinch under pressure and didn't mistake volume for virtue. To Judy, every courtroom was a battlefield, a place where discipline triumphed over disorder. But AOC had come from different battlefields, the kind with broken sidewalks, underfunded schools, eviction notices tucked under apartment doors. So to her, the idea of order felt different, not like safety, but like silence forced on those who never got the mic. And that's where Judy's legacy met its first real test. Not in the form of disrespect, but in the form of a calmly placed mirror. Because the question AOC brought wasn't, "What have you done?" It was, "What did you believe you were doing?" And who was never invited to answer back. In that moment, Judy wasn't on trial, but her framework was. And for someone who built a life on certainties, it was the uncertainty that now pressed hardest. She'd spent a lifetime delivering consequences. But tonight, she was about to feel context. And context doesn't shout. It lingers. It pulls back the curtain on even the most polished legacy and asks, without rage or ridicule, was it justice or just judgment? And that, AOC knew, was a far heavier question than any gavel could end. The pause had lasted long enough. Judge Judy leaned forward, her voice louder now, not just in volume, but in edge. Her patience had thinned, not because of disrespect, but because she was beginning to lose control of the room. And so she did what legacy power often does when challenged. It pushed back, hard and personal. "Maybe your generation should stop whining," she said, each word landing with a snap, "and start taking ownership." A sharp inhale cut through the studio. Not quite a gasp, but close. A few heads turned in the audience. One woman in the second row actually mouthed the word Whoa. Anderson Cooper's smile flickered. He recognized the shift too. This wasn't policy anymore. This was personal, and not just to AOC. To every younger viewer who'd ever been told they were too sensitive, too entitled, too loud for asking questions about the world they were expected to inherit without comment. AOC didn't speak right away. She didn't blink. She didn't adjust her mic or flick her hair like someone preparing to perform. She just sat there entirely still. The silence for a split second belonged to her. Then she leaned in. Not aggressive, not performative. Just close enough for the mic to catch her words without a single decibel of strain. "What do you own?" she asked, "when the system sold you short before you could afford a voice?" It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was an indictment, without raising a finger. And it landed not with thunder, but with weight, the kind that rearranges a room without noise. She didn't wait for Judy to answer. She didn't need to. The question wasn't for Judy. It was for everyone who'd been told that asking for fairness is weakness, that pointing out inequality is victimhood, that rage is the only tone that counts as disrespect. AOC continued, her tone even, her cadence steady. "You say my generation whines, but what you call whining, I call testifying. I call surviving systems we didn't build, but are punished for not thriving in." She gestured slightly, not at Judy, but at the invisible system they were both talking about from opposite ends. "I grew up in a neighborhood where eviction wasn't a threat. It was a calendar event, where school doors had metal detectors and libraries had missing pages. You talk about ownership? We tried to own what we had, but it was already rented out by policy, by redlining, by zip codes that doubled as sentencing guidelines." Judy sat back, her arms now crossed tighter. Not angry, at least not just angry. Defensive, maybe uncertain, but unwilling to retreat. AOC's eyes softened for a moment, not out of pity but resolve. "I'm not here to whine. I'm here to remind people that some of us were handed less and still made more out of it. That doesn't make us entitled. It makes us exhausted and still showing up anyway." The studio fell silent, not stunned but sobered. That was the line Judy crossed, not in questioning AOC's views, but in reducing a generational reckoning to a character flaw. And in doing so, she'd missed the shift already happening across America, that younger generations weren't asking for handouts. They were asking why the same hands always seemed to be holding the scales. And now, for the first time that night, it wasn't Judy who had the last word. It was the quiet in the room, asking itself who really needed to own what. The silence after AOC's last answer was different from the ones before. It wasn't just respectful, it was loaded. The kind of quiet that follows something too uncomfortable to applaud, too true to dismiss, and too real to unhear. Even the hum of the studio lights felt louder. Judy shifted slightly in her seat, folding and unfolding her hands in a rhythm that suggested she wasn't used to being held in place this long, especially not by someone whose tone hadn't cracked once. AOC waited, not to provoke, not to win. She waited because she understood something most people never learn when arguing. Silence is often the only space where people actually hear themselves. She let the moment breathe. Then, just when the room began to settle again, she leaned forward. Not with urgency, but with clarity, her voice soft, almost gentle, like the question she was about to ask had waited years to be spoken aloud. "Judge," she said, "in your decades on the bench, did you ever ask why certain zip codes kept coming back again and again?" It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't sarcastic. It was the kind of question that only stings because it sounds like a whisper, but lands like an echo from the past. The kind of question that doesn't scream for answers. It demands a reckoning. Judy straightened, not out of confidence but instinct. She blinked once, twice, and then gave her answer the way people do when they think they're stating a fact. Flat, fast, and without apology. "Because those ZIP codes have more crime." She said it with finality, as if the subject were closed, as if reality were a spreadsheet, as if people and places could be distilled into bar graphs and dots on a map without asking who was drawing the lines in the first place. And then it came. AOC didn't raise her eyebrows. She didn't shake her head or scoff. She just let a faint breath pass through her nose. The kind that said, "I've heard that answer before." and I'm still here." She nodded slowly once and responded, not with fire but with the kind of weight that bends air. "Or maybe," she said, "they just had more patrols, more searches, more cuffs, less leniency, less assumptions of innocence, more hands against the wall, more policies written by people who never lived there." The words weren't rapid. They were deliberate, spaced like stone steps down into a deeper truth. Her eyes didn't leave Judy's, not to challenge, but to insist that this moment wouldn't be skipped. "And maybe the reason those zip codes keep coming back," she continued, "is because we never stop sending the same message, that justice isn't a system, it's a spotlight, and it never seems to shine on the suburbs." A beat passed. The audience didn't move. Even the camera crew froze, as if to make sure not a syllable was lost. AOC wasn't done. "You want to talk about crime," she said, voice still calm, "but we rarely ask about survival, about the cost of living where buses stop running at 9 p.m., jobs pay just enough to keep you needing 3, and schools have more cops than counselors. We don't criminalize actions, we criminalize patterns. Patterns of poverty, patterns of proximity, patterns of pain mistaken for defiance." Judy tried to interject, her lips parting slightly, but no sound followed. Not yet. There was nothing left to argue with in that moment, only something to confront. AOC let her final sentence drop like a quiet gavel. "And if all we ever do is point to the data without asking who wrote the conditions, we're not judging fairly, we're just punishing predictably." No applause, no viral catchphrase, just a room that suddenly felt too bright, too cold, too aware of itself. Because the truth doesn't need to yell to leave a mark. Sometimes it only needs to be asked, softly. There's a point in every conversation where data either deepens the truth or derails it. AOC knew that well. She also knew Judge Judy had made a career on anecdote, memorable stories, sharp judgments, fast conclusions. And for TV, that worked. It always had. But policy wasn't entertainment, and pain, when simplified for prime time, lost the names that once gave it meaning. So she didn't raise her voice when she returned to the mic. She raised the stakes. "I want to ground this conversation in something a little less debatable," she said, calmly flipping to a page in her notebook. "Because when we strip justice down to instinct or impulse, we forget how measurable the injustice actually is." Her voice didn't waver. Her posture didn't shift. It was like watching someone perform surgery with facts. No wasted motion, no sudden force, just precision. She glanced at her notes, not to perform knowledge, but to affirm it. Black Americans receive prison sentences that are, on average, 19% longer than white Americans for the exact same crimes, she began. That's not a blog post. That's from the United States Sentencing Commission. A few murmurs rose from the audience. Not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to signal the tension was rippling. She continued, "And when it comes to federal drug offenses, Black defendants are more likely to be charged with offenses that carry mandatory minimums." Mandatory, that means no context, no discretion, just a number written in law, regardless of the life it lands on. She looked up now, letting her eyes sweep across the crowd, not in challenge, but in invitation. "Justice without data," she said slowly, "is anecdote. And anecdote is how power avoids accountability." The sentence didn't thunder, but it hit like a slow wave. Quiet, relentless, and impossible to ignore. It didn't accuse anyone in particular, but it named the pattern. When individual stories are used to defend systemic outcomes, the system gets to walk away unexamined. Judge Judy shifted slightly, not out of discomfort perhaps, but calculation. She was used to being the one who cut through noise. But here, the clarity wasn't hers. AOC kept going, not with cold detachment, but with that particular urgency that comes from knowing the numbers aren't abstract when you've seen their consequences up close. "I've watched a teenager get 10 years because his court-appointed attorney didn't have time to explain a plea deal. I've seen a mother lose her home because her eviction court date got rescheduled without notice. I've seen people spend more time in jail waiting for trial than they ever would have served if they were guilty." She paused, not for effect, but because truth sometimes requires space to breathe. We call that the justice system, but it behaves more like a punishment pipeline, one that runs on algorithms, zip codes, and political convenience. She leaned back slightly, letting her hands rest on her lap. I don't tell you this to win an argument. I tell you this because somewhere, a 17-year-old just got arrested for the third time for something that wouldn't even make the news in another neighborhood. And we can talk about choices all day, but systems create the menu. The audience was silent now, not out of boredom, but wait. You could almost hear people rearranging what they thought they knew. Judge Judy looked at her, not dismissively, not amused, just still. The kind of stillness that happens when someone hears something they don't want to believe, but can't refute. AOC closed her notebook gently. Every statistic I gave you has a name behind it, a life, a parent, a future. And if we don't care enough to count them, we've already decided who gets counted. And with that, she sat back, not to retreat, but to let the truth do what she never needed to yell for, be recognized. The weight in the room had shifted, and Judge Judy could feel it. Not in a dramatic collapse, but in something subtler, like footing on a floor that had quietly tilted. She wasn't used to being answered with silence, or worse, with facts that didn't shout back, just stood their ground. So she did what many seasoned voices do when the ground begins to feel unfamiliar. She leaned on experience like a shield. I've seen real people, she said, her voice sharpened with emphasis. You've seen papers. It was meant as a jab, not cruel but cutting, a reminder that lived experience trumps research, that courtroom grit outweighs policy theory. And for years that distinction might have held power, but tonight it missed something. AOC didn't flinch. She didn't scramble to rebut. Instead, she opened the soft brown folder sitting beside her, unassuming, almost invisible until now. The motion wasn't grand, no flourish, just a quiet reveal. Inside were 3 pages. She held one up, gently but deliberately, and let the camera catch the black and white image printed across the top. A woman, eyes swollen from crying, holding her daughter's backpack. The kind of photo that didn't make headlines, but lived on government servers attached to case numbers. AOC's voice steady. This isn't just a paper. She turned it toward the audience. This is a woman who lost custody of her child because she missed a court date. Why did she miss it? Because the bus line was cut the week before? No lawyer, no notice, no second chance. She looked at Judy, not with accusation, but with the gravity of someone carrying too many of these names to let them be dismissed as footnotes. That's not theory. That's someone's life paused because the system pressed fast forward. The sentence didn't land like a punch. It landed like truth unrolling slowly across the floor. And it didn't need to be loud, because it was already known by too many in the room. I didn't meet her on paper, AOC continued. I met her in housing court in the Bronx. I sat next to her while the clerk explained why no legal aid was available that week. I held her hand while the decision came down like weather, unpredictable, indifferent, and cold. She turned to the second page. Another name, another face. This young man spent 7 months in Rikers waiting for trial. The charges were dropped, but by then he'd already lost his job, his apartment, and 2 teeth. Judy shifted again. Her hands folded across her lap now, didn't quite know what to do. The old rhythm, question, cut, control, was slipping. AOC placed the papers back into the folder as if returning someone's dignity to where it belonged. So when I talk about numbers, she said, it's not because I lack heart. It's because I've seen too many hearts broken under the weight of decisions made without them. The audience was still. One man in the back crossed his arms, but his eyes didn't leave AOC. Even Judy's defenders seemed quieter, like they were searching for a foothold that no longer existed. Judy tried to speak again, but the moment had moved. The room had heard enough to stop clapping instinctively and start listening consciously. This wasn't about who had seen more people. It was about who had seen them longer, not just in court, but in context. And tonight, it was becoming harder to argue that lived experience only counts when it wears a robe. For a moment, the folder on AOC's lap stayed closed, but her hands remained on it, like someone remembering not just what was inside, but who. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted again, not toward drama, but towards something heavier, less performative, more real. She looked out, not at Judge Judy this time, but past her, past the audience, past the cameras, as if she were speaking to someone who wasn't in the room but should have been. "There was a boy I met in Queens," she began, her voice low and even. 16, Dominican American, first generation. His name was Miguel, but everybody in his building called him Miko. He was small for his age, quieter than most, the kind of kid who apologized for taking up space. She didn't pause for effect, only to keep control of the memory. One night, he was stopped leaving the subway. He had 2 oxy pills in his sock. 2. He said they weren't his, and maybe they were, maybe they weren't. That wasn't what broke him. What broke him was that by the time his public defender got his name right, the plea deal was already gone. A hush fell over the audience, thicker than before. No fidgeting, no camera clicks, just a room slowly realizing this wasn't a story, this was a boy. "They gave him 10 years, AOC said plainly. Not for violence, not for trafficking, for possession. 2 pills, no prior record." Someone in the crowd whispered, 10? But didn't say it again. She continued, 10 years meant missing his little brother's graduation, missing his mother's cancer treatment, missing every single formative moment a person is supposed to have between 16 and 26. And when he got out, no job, no housing, no second chance, just a folder full of rejections. She looked down at her hands for a second, not out of shame or uncertainty, but reverence. That's what numbers become when you stop abstracting them. They become Miko. They become a face you can't forget, no matter how many congressional briefings you sit through. Judge Judy shifted in her seat. She didn't speak, but her eyes narrowed slightly, as if searching for a crack in the narrative. Anything that could reduce it to an exception, a misunderstanding, a one-off tragedy, but AOC didn't give her that out. Miko was charged under a statute that didn't allow the judge to consider context, just category, controlled substance, school zone, automatic minimum, that's it, no nuance. No room to ask why a kid with no history, no weapon, and no violence was being treated like a career criminal. She turned slightly toward Judy now, not confrontational, just deliberate. "You want to talk about responsibility. Miko took responsibility for his life the moment he stopped running, but the system never took responsibility for him. It didn't ask what drove him to that corner. It didn't ask who failed him before the cops showed up. It just calculated, processed, and sentenced." Then came the part that no one in the room could have prepared for. AOC opened the folder again. This time she didn't show a photo, just a single sentence from the transcript. He said to the judge, quote, "Please don't treat me like a number. I'm still trying to be somebody." No one clapped. No one moved. Because how do you respond to a kid pleading to be seen and being buried in policy instead? AOC let the folder close again, quietly, with care. 10 years, she repeated, for 2 pills, for being brown, for being in the wrong zip code, for being too quiet to scare anyone, and too invisible to matter. Her eyes swept the room one more time. "You call that justice. I call that forgetting who the system is supposed to serve." And in that moment, every statistic she had shared up until now grew a face, a voice, a life paused in mid-sentence. And for the first time that night, even Judy seemed unsure whether her courtroom rules applied here. There are moments when silence speaks louder than defiance. For the first time that evening, Judge Judy didn't have a rebuttal. Her arms were crossed, her jaw set, but no sound followed the story of Miko. No clever retort, no dismissal. Just a quiet that clung to the edges of the studio like a fog no one expected. AOC didn't push the silence away. She let it sit, because some truths don't need to be hammered in. They just need to be heard without interruption. And then she spoke, not louder, not sharper, just more precise. "Toughness that ignores cause," she said, voice steady, "is not discipline. It's vengeance in disguise." The sentence didn't just land. It settled into the air like dust after demolition. She wasn't talking about one boy anymore. She was talking about the whole machine, the one that prided itself on being tough, as if cruelty were the same thing as clarity. "We praise harshness like it's a virtue," she continued, eyes sweeping the stage. But what we rarely ask is, who absorbs the cost of that harshness? Who gets shaped by it? Who gets shattered? She didn't need charts now. Her data had faces. You see, when someone comes from power, from access, from a neighborhood where mistakes are handled with counseling and community service, we call that rehabilitation. But when someone grows up with no health care, no guidance counselors, no safety net, we call their same mistake a pattern, and we punish the pattern instead of asking where it began. She glanced briefly at Judge Judy, not confrontationally, but as a necessary acknowledgement of what they both represented. One built a career showing what happens when people break the rules. The other built a life asking who wrote the rules and for whom they were meant to break. Judy shifted but still said nothing. Her fingers twitched slightly, and though her mouth stayed closed, her body spoke. It said, this wasn't the stage she thought she'd be standing on. AOC pressed forward, not to gloat but to reveal. We've been taught that justice is firm, she said, that it's blind, that it doesn't bend. But let's be honest, it does bend. It just usually bends toward comfort, toward power, toward leniency for the already forgiven. She stepped deeper now, not into anger but into moral clarity. Because the truth is, we don't need tougher judges. We need a system that doesn't need toughness to be fair. That line made someone in the audience inhale sharply, and another nod silently. It was the kind of sentence people don't forget, not because it's dramatic, but because it tells the truth without trying to make you feel better. We've convinced ourselves that being harsh means being responsible, she added, but that's not accountability. That's deflection. That's punishment doing the job of policy. That's fear replacing vision. She looked again at the crowd, at the faces that had gone from spectators to witnesses. And I know people will say, well, if you're not tough, then you're soft on crime. But what I'm saying is, how can we call it soft to care about why a kid ended up in front of a judge in the first place? How can it be soft to ask whether a sentence fixes anything or just postpones the next tragedy? The studio lights felt warmer now, not because the temperature had changed, but because the tension had. The lines were no longer drawn between ideology and position. They were drawn between memory and myth, between what justice is and what we pretend it has always been. Judge Judy exhaled, long and slow. Her gaze wasn't on AOC anymore. It was somewhere behind her, somewhere distant, somewhere where the idea of control was simpler, easier, uninterrupted. But here, in this moment, she wasn't the only voice that mattered. And AOC, who never once raised hers, had taken command not by overpowering, but by unveiling. This wasn't softness. It was the courage to stop pretending that power must always wear a scowl to be taken seriously. And the studio, for once, didn't feel like a courtroom. It felt like a question being asked to an entire country. What if we stopped rewarding the performance of justice and started rebuilding the substance of it? You could feel it before you could see it. A subtle change in posture, the quiet lowering of crossed arms, the kind of shift that doesn't scream agreement, but signals a door opening. One woman in the third row stopped scribbling in her notebook and simply watched. A man with a folded program in his lap uncrossed his legs, leaned forward. Some audience members nodded, slowly at first, as if giving themselves permission to reconsider. Then came the voice from the back, clear, curious, young. A white college student in a flannel shirt stood up, maybe 21. He didn't raise his voice to make a point. He raised it like someone genuinely asking. So, then what does justice actually look like? It wasn't a challenge. It was the kind of question asked by someone who realized they'd inherited a definition, but never dared to ask who wrote it. AOC turned toward him, gently. No lecturing, no talking down, just presence, the kind that doesn't require a podium to carry weight. She let the question breathe, then answered, the words shaped not by theory, but by lived truth. It looks like equity before evidence, she said, the cadence deliberate. Context before sentence, humanity before headline. The room didn't applaud, but it listened harder. That was the win. Not noise, but depth. She continued, not with a list, but with meaning sewn into each phrase. Justice looks like asking what a child needed before we ask what they did. It looks like understanding the difference between a pattern of behavior and a pattern of being failed. A nod from the moderator. Another from a teacher in the back row. No one interrupted. It looks like ending the cycle where punishment is the first tool and empathy is the afterthought. Where we act like fairness means giving everyone the same, but forget that some of us are starting from places generations behind. She paused and looked toward Judge Judy, not confrontationally, but honestly. And I know that can sound idealistic, but if we don't imagine better, we just keep replicating broken. The young man nodded slowly, not as someone who had just agreed with a politician, but as someone who had just unlearned something and was glad for it. AOC glanced around the room now. It's easy to reduce justice to what we do after something happens, but the real work starts long before that. It's in who gets the benefit of the doubt, who gets second chances, who gets believed. That's justice. She turned again to the student. And it looks like rooms like this, where people stop pretending discomfort is the same thing as disrespect, and start being brave enough to ask, what if we were wrong about what justice has looked like all along? That was the turning point. People didn't clap, they internalized. That's when a message is no longer performance. It's recognition. You could see it on their faces. Not everyone agreed with everything, but they heard it. Not just the arguments, the honesty. Judge Judy shifted in her seat again, still silent. Not silence, just outpaced. Not because she had nothing to say, but because the room had stopped revolving around her rhythm. AOC didn't lean back like she had landed a blow. She stayed still, almost reverent to the moment that had just unfolded, not from her, but around her. Anderson Cooper, sensing the shift, kept quiet too. His job was no longer to moderate. The room was doing that on its own. For the first time that evening, it felt less like a broadcast and more like a reckoning. And maybe, just maybe, justice had started to look like a room that dared to rethink itself. Not by shouting, but by finally listening. By now, the momentum in the room had clearly shifted. What began as a televised conversation had turned into something much deeper, something unplanned, uncomfortable, and unavoidable. AOC hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't interrupted. She hadn't struck with sarcasm. And yet somehow the center of gravity had moved to her side of the table. Judge Judy felt it, and she didn't like the tilt. So she pushed back. "You're good at talking," she said, her voice firmer now, her tone clipped like punctuation. "But I live this system." It wasn't a legal argument, it was personal. The kind of line meant to remind everyone in the room who had the decades, the bench, the legacy. It was a move of hierarchy, not logic. And for a moment it landed the way she'd hoped. Sharp, definitive, signaling authority. But AOC didn't flinch. She didn't return fire. She just nodded slowly as if she'd been waiting for that exact line to be said out loud. "Yes," she replied, her voice calm but weighted. And so did the people it failed. The air in the room thinned again, because with one sentence, she reframed everything. Experience wasn't the sole property of those in power. Living inside a system didn't automatically mean understanding it, especially if your position had always been behind the bench, not in front of it, and especially if you'd never once been forced to swallow the sentence without ever being allowed to speak. Judy opened her mouth again, this time trying to pivot, regain some control. "This isn't law school," she said, waving her hand slightly as if brushing off a textbook. "This is reality." But it didn't land the way it once might have. The room didn't laugh. The audience didn't lean in for the takedown. Instead, people waited, because they knew what was coming wasn't theory. It was truth delivered the way only someone who's lived it can deliver. AOC turned to face her fully now, voice steady, eyes unwavering. "Reality," she said, "doesn't start when the camera rolls." She let that hang. For some of us, it started before the lights ever came on, in housing courts where no one brought a mic, in classroom where we were told we were loud instead of smart, in neighborhoods where consequences arrived long before we ever had a chance to cause anything. Her words didn't attack. They unfolded, slowly, carefully, but each one cut deeper than volume ever could. "You talk about reality like it's something you walk into, But for a lot of us, it's something we wake up inside of. And the rules? They don't feel written. They feel inherited. Judy sat back, not slouched, but smaller than she'd appeared earlier. Not because she had nothing left to say, but because the weight of what had just been said made reflexes feel like noise. AOC didn't gloat. She didn't fill the silence with self-congratulation. She simply placed her hands together, fingers interlaced, and breathed, as if to remind herself, and everyone watching, that clarity doesn't come from domination. It comes from being willing to tell the truth, even when no one has asked for it, especially then. And in that moment, the personal blow Judy had tried to deliver became something else entirely. Not a wound, but a mirror. It wasn't just the lights that made the studio feel exposed now. It was the accumulation of stories, of statistics, of moments where one woman held the gavel and the other held the weight of what that gavel had meant for people like her. And as Judge Judy tried to regroup, she reached not for argument, but for hierarchy, for the comfort of her own elevation. "You're here because you sound smart," she said flatly, eyes fixed on AOC like a challenge. "I was there because I made decisions." The sentence landed hard, but not clean. There was something brittle in it, like it had been said before in smaller rooms, with less resistance. It was the voice of power trying to remind the room why it should still be in charge. The audience didn't react, not with gasps, not with claps, just stillness. And AOC didn't look up right away. She let the moment drift past her like wind against stone. Then slowly she raised her eyes, not wide with surprise, but focused. Sharp in that quiet way she'd carried all evening, like someone who didn't need to win a moment to own it. Her voice was low, measured, but each word landed with unmistakable force. "Sometimes," she said, "the hardest decision is knowing when you've been wrong the longest." She didn't blink, didn't smile, just let the weight of it sink in, not as a punch, but as a reckoning. "You think I'm here because I sound smart," she continued, "but I'm here because for too long, decisions were made without people like me in the room. And sounding smart was never enough to get invited." The words carried something deeper than rebuttal. They carried inheritance. In rejection of the idea that presence is permission, AOC wasn't asking to be validated. She was refusing to be reduced. "You sat on the bench," she said. "You handed down consequences. But consequences without introspection aren't justice. They're habit. They're tradition disguised as truth." Judy shifted. Her hands moved briefly but didn't rise. Her mouth tightened, but no reply came. AOC leaned forward slightly, not to dominate, but to emphasize. "And let's be clear, I respect the work. I respect anyone who dedicates their life to serving the law. But I won't confuse repetition with righteousness. And I won't mistake time served on the bench for time spent questioning the system beneath it." Her tone never rose, but it vibrated with something deeper than frustration, something closer to grief. "For years, we've called that decisiveness. But what if it was denial?" Silence again. Not emptiness, just the absence of defensiveness. The studio seemed to hold its breath. AOC finally leaned back in her chair, composed, clear. "I didn't come here to trade credentials. I came here to challenge conclusions. Because sounding smart might get you heard, but telling the truth? That's what makes the room go quiet." And that's exactly what it had done. Judy, once the voice that could halt an argument with a glare, now sat with nothing to say. Not because she lacked experience, but because for the first time, experience had been questioned not with contempt, but with courage. It wasn't the sharpest line of the night, but it was the deepest. And when spoken in that quiet, undeniable tone, like a closing statement you don't need a courtroom to deliver, it landed exactly where it was meant to. Not in her opponent, but in the country listening. The camera almost instinctively found its mark. It moved in on Judge Judy's face, not with malice, not to mock, but because this was the moment that defined the shift. Her eyes, once sharp with certainty, now searched for footing. Her mouth, slightly open, didn't move. No notes to shuffle, no prepared statement to reach for. Just silence, and a gaze that looked past the lights, past the audience, to someplace far quieter, and less sure than where she'd started. It wasn't the kind of defeat that explodes. It was the kind that folds inward, a slow recognition that the usual tools, authority, posture, the well-timed interruption, had met something immune to all of it. And beside her, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't lean forward. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply spoke, softly, as if she were naming something that had already happened, rather than trying to cause it. You judged. I listened. You closed cases. I opened conversations. Each sentence carried the weight of contrast, role versus purpose, position versus process. There was no need to explain it further. Everyone in the room had seen it unfold. You spoke in conclusions, AOC continued, voice even and calm. I speak in conditions. Judy's hands, once folded with control, were now loosely resting on her lap, palms down, fingers still. The difference between being in charge and being out of rhythm. AOC didn't press the moment for drama. She honored it for what it was, a reckoning, not a performance. Her tone stayed steady, not for the audience, but because that's what truth does when it doesn't have to shout to be believed. There is a kind of collapse, she said, that doesn't happen with noise. It happens when the room hears something it can't unhear, when the air changes and power realizes it's been outgrown. Nobody clapped. Nobody needed to. She turned her gaze toward the audience now, not seeking approval, but inviting them to consider what they just witnessed. You held court, she said gently, in a world where verdicts were final and questions were distractions. I live in a world where questions are the only thing that keep us breathing. It wasn't about Judy anymore. It was about the system she embodied, one where justice had too often been a transaction instead of a transformation, where the performance of order replaced the pursuit of fairness, and the collapse wasn't hers alone. It was the collapse of a way of thinking, quietly cracking in real time. AOC paused, then said one final thing, not to bury, but to liberate. Sometimes what looks like losing control is really just letting truth have the mic. And with that, she let the silence return. This time it didn't feel tense. It felt earned. The camera lingered just long enough to capture Judy blinking twice, then looking down. Not in shame, not exactly, but in a way that suggested something had landed deeper than she'd expected. AOC didn't move to speak again. She didn't need to. Some moments are loud, others are lasting, and this one didn't end with applause. It ended with stillness, and the quiet realization that not every collapse needs volume to make history. There's a particular kind of hush that settles into a room after something irreversible is said. Not the awkward silence of tension or the stunned pause that follows spectacle, but a quiet charged with recognition. That's what filled the CNN studio in the seconds after AOC's final line. It wasn't that the audience didn't know how to react. It was that they understood they weren't supposed to react the way they usually do. So they didn't. No cheers, no shouts, just a long, breath-held stillness that wrapped itself around the edges of the set. Until finally, one person began to clap, then another, then a third. Not rapid, not wild, just slow, deliberate, dignified, like the room was finally catching up to what had happened, and choosing not noise but acknowledgement. AOC stood with the same posture she'd carried all evening, steady, shoulders open, eyes level. She wasn't bracing for backlash or searching for praise. She looked like someone who had said exactly what needed to be said and had nothing to add. And then, with no change in expression, she gave the final sentence of the night. Not shouted, not forced, just placed, like a seed she knew would grow long after the camera stopped rolling. The loudest voice isn't always right. It's just louder. And for too long, that was enough. That line didn't spark applause, it clarified it. The clapping grew, still measured but fuller now, as if the audience had made a decision, as if they'd realized this wasn't about agreeing with every word, or even understanding every detail. It was about recognizing a moment where someone challenged power without mimicking it. Judge Judy remained seated, silent. Her expression wasn't angry, just faded, less certain, as if someone had rearranged the set she thought she was sitting on. For decades, her voice had been the one that controlled the room. Tonight it had been absorbed, then outlived. AOC didn't turn to her. She didn't need to. She turned to the crowd instead, offering a nod. Not of victory, but of mutual responsibility. A silent message. You heard this. What you do with it is yours now. The applause didn't erupt. It pulsed. Each clap, like punctuation to a conversation that finally made space for what had long been pushed aside. Anderson Cooper cleared his throat, half in admiration, half in hesitation. But even he knew better than to step in too fast. For the first time, maybe in her whole political career, AOC had said something that wasn't meant to go viral, but almost certainly would. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. Because people didn't just watch her tonight, they witnessed her. And more importantly, they recognized themselves in the way she didn't flinch, didn't rush, didn't bend. She didn't win with volume. She won by refusing to confuse clarity with cruelty, by standing still when others would have leaned forward, and by reminding everyone that some mics aren't dropped with noise. Some are set down, gently. But once they hit the floor, nothing sounds the same again. The studio lights hadn't even cooled before the clip began its ascent. In an age of jump cuts and echo chambers, it was rare for something to trend not because it was loud, but because it was still. The video, 43 seconds long, captured just one sentence, a deliberate pause, and the sound of a microphone being gently placed on the desk. AOC stood slowly after her final line. No grand gesture, just a stillness that drew the eye. Her last words, delivered in that clear, calm tone, lingered longer than the applause had. Strength isn't how you end a sentence, it's whether what you say still matters when the mic is off. She didn't wait for a cue. She didn't check the host. She turned, nodded once to the room, and walked out. That was it. But somehow, it was everything. Within minutes, the clip surged across platforms, not through influencers or coordinated campaigns, but through organic momentum. Teachers reposted it with captions like, "This is how you model integrity." Law students tagged their professors, "Required viewing." Even a few public defenders, normally cautious with praise, shared it simply with the hashtag #Quiet Power Trend. The conversation shifted. For once, the focus wasn't on who got destroyed or humiliated. The tone online was different, reflective, even reverent. People weren't sharing it to cheer. They were sharing it because it made them pause. One tweet read, "I watched to see someone get wrecked. I left wondering if I've ever said something that would matter after I stopped talking." 100,000 likes in 2 hours. The clip reached beyond political lines. A retired Republican judge in Ohio reposted it with a surprising admission. "I may not agree with her politics, but this was judicial temperament in its truest form." Somewhere between the scroll and the silence, the debate stopped being about who was right. It became about what kind of voice people wanted to follow. On TikTok, teens remixed the line with lo-fi piano. On Instagram, graphic designers turned it into typographic posters. The quote, "Whether what you say still matters when the mic is off," appeared on cafe chalkboards, sermon slides, campus whiteboards, and across dinner tables, the moment sparked something rare. Intergenerational dialogue. A grandfather in Atlanta told his granddaughter, "That young woman reminded me of the marches." Not in what she said, in how she stood. She replied, "I didn't even know politics could feel like that." The network reran the episode uncut for the first time in years. Not for ratings, but because they couldn't not. And back at her office, AOC said nothing online. No follow-up tweet, no quote tweet, no victory lap. Just one repost of someone else's video, captioned only with, "Say it so it matters." In a world that prizes volume, she offered value. In a culture obsessed with trending, she reminded people of what echoes. And in a political moment built on interruption, she didn't fight for airtime. She built resonance instead. What came next wasn't louder, it was deeper. And long after the mic had been turned off, the country kept listening. It started as a post with fewer than 100 followers. A second-year law student at Howard University uploaded a still frame of the broadcast. AOC mid-sentence, eyes locked, no script in sight. The caption read, "That wasn't a debate. It was a class in moral clarity." By dawn, it was being quoted by professors in lecture halls from Columbia to Berkeley. Not for its theatrics, but for something rarer, a moment where conviction didn't need to be shouted to be heard. Law schools began adding the clip to their ethics modules. Not just criminal law classes, but those on constitutional interpretation, rhetoric, even restorative justice. The question posed in classrooms shifted from who won to what standard did we just witness. Media critics called it a new template for public discourse. One NPR host referred to it as a quiet reckoning. A Harvard dean described it more bluntly. It reminded the bar why we even have a bench. And as that momentum surged, Judge Judy's seat remained empty. 3 weeks, no interviews, no red carpet panels, no commentary. Her team said she was taking personal time. But the silence wasn't just scheduling, it was consequence. Meanwhile, AOC returned to New York's 14th district. No press conferences, no merch drops. Just stops at community clinics, a round table with foster care advocates, a visit to a Bronx food co-op run by undocumented teens. She didn't bring up the moment. Others did. A young man at the co-op hesitated before speaking. "What you said, it made me feel like maybe we're not the only ones who see it." She smiled gently. "You were never invisible. They just needed help seeing clearly." Back in D.C., a conservative commentator wrote, "I disagree with her economics, but even I had to admit that was restraint paired with backbone, and I'm not sure our side has that anymore." A union leader from Detroit called into a local radio station. "It wasn't just that she out-argued the judge. It's that she respected us enough not to perform. She trusted us to think." And across dinner tables, church groups, book clubs, and schoolyards, the ripple continued. What began as confrontation had become calibration. It wasn't that AOC had defeated Judy. It was that she had redefined what judgment could sound like. The final proof didn't come from a trending hashtag or broadcast ratings. It came from the echo of her absence. No victory parade. No, "I told you so." Just continued service. Grounded, present, quietly radical in its consistency. Somewhere in a law school in Iowa, a professor replayed the clip and asked the room, "If our justice system spoke like this, who would feel safer? Who would feel seen?" And in a small notebook AOC carried, she wrote a line late one night after the noise had faded. "When power forgets how to listen, we answer not with noise, but with the kind of silence that makes the room stop pretending it knows." By then, it wasn't just about the mic being off. It was about what remained audible when the applause had passed. And the verdict, it seemed, had already been delivered by a nation that saw not who raised their voice, but who raised the standard. The fluorescent lights in the Bronx Re-Entry Center flickered slightly, not out of disrepair, but from age, like the building itself, worn but still standing. On the wall near the reception desk, a laminated flyer read, "We don't just welcome you back, we walk with you forward." AOC stood near the coffee table, coat still buttoned. No cameras followed her. No sound engineer checked the mic. This wasn't a studio, and it wasn't for a headline. It was just Tuesday, her kind of Tuesday. The men and women around her had stories that didn't fit cleanly in 30-minute television segments. One had missed the birth of his son. Another had taught himself to code in a cell block. A woman, early 40s, said her parole officer treated her with more dignity than the courtroom that sentenced her. Then a man stood up, mid-50s, steady hands, clear voice. He pointed gently toward AOC. "I remember sitting in that fake courtroom, the one with all the lights. I remember her looking at me like I was already a punchline." AOC didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. He continued, "But then I watched you. And for once, someone didn't raise their voice to sound powerful. You lowered yours to make power listen." The room fell still. The woman next to him nodded. Another murmured, "That part." He added quietly, "You didn't just speak for you. You spoke for all of us," she dismissed. AOC stepped forward, but didn't respond with a speech. Instead, she offered a question. "What would justice have looked like if someone had asked you first?" A few in the room exchanged glances, half startled, half moved. It wasn't rhetorical. She meant it. A former welder who now ran a peer support group answered, It would have looked like someone knowing my zip code didn't mean I was dangerous. Just tired. Another man added, it would have meant not assuming I was lying the second I said I didn't do it. AOC listened, jotting quick notes in a small, battered notebook. She didn't promise funding, didn't list legislation. She just made space, and the room filled it. On her way out, she paused in front of the center's mural. Painted by those inside, it showed a hallway stretching into a sunrise. No bars, no gavels, just open light. The program director joined her and whispered, what you did on that show, it didn't end there. People walked different after. AOC smiled gently. We all walk different after being seen. As she exited, a teenage volunteer passed her a folder, Poems from Returning Citizens. On the cover, one title stood alone, Not Just a Case File. Back in D.C., media cycles were still dissecting her exchange with Judge Judy. Think pieces debated whether emotion belonged in law. Some praised her composure. Others accused her of grandstanding. But here in the heart of her district, the verdict was already in. It wasn't about who won. It was about who made the system feel less distant, and the people inside it less disposable. And as she boarded the subway home, coat now unbuttoned, she thought of something the man had said. You didn't just speak for you. She stared out the window, the Bronx lights flickering past. No camera, no stage, just echoes turning into steps. They came in waves, emails, handwritten notes, messages folded 3 times inside children's drawings. Not the kind of mail sorted by interns. These were read slowly, deliberately, like prayers passed between strangers who had finally found a voice that matched their silence. AOC sat cross-legged on the floor of her small DC office, shoes off, tea cooling beside her. Around her, envelopes opened with care, typed notes printed on school computer paper, scribbles from middle schoolers with stickers on the corners. One email began simply, I raised my kids on her show. Now I want my grandkids to listen to you. It came from a retired English teacher in Wisconsin. She spoke of afternoons when TV courtrooms taught her children the difference between consequences and cruelty. But lately, the message said, I wonder what those shows taught us about mercy. And now, after watching you, I'm beginning to relearn. AOC folded the letter back gently, not out of nostalgia, but respect. She had long believed that change doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as reflection. Another message, this time from a student in Georgia, read, I didn't think someone could beat a judge without yelling. You did. I want to be like that. She smiled, not because of praise, but because of what it meant. That strength had been redefined for someone watching, not as noise, but as presence, not as domination, but as clarity that doesn't beg for volume. A package arrived from a high school civics class in El Paso. Inside, a homemade zine titled Justice is Listening. Each page held a quote from AOC's exchange with Judy, paired with student reflections. One page simply read, We never thought court shows were wrong. Now we're thinking harder. That line stayed with her. Elsewhere, a grandmother from Michigan enclosed a copy of her diary page from the night of the broadcast. She wrote, When you looked at her and said, That's not a paper, that's someone's life, I wept, because that paper could have been my son's. The letters weren't all reverent. Some were full of tension, viewers unsure of what they felt, but certain something had shifted. One said, I'm not even sure I agree with you, but I've never rewatched a congressional segment 3 times, and I did. Some messages didn't speak of politics at all, just tone, just presence. You didn't roll your eyes. You didn't call her names. You didn't make me feel small for having watched her. And maybe that was the point. She hadn't just won a debate. She had opened a space for a different kind of conversation, one where dignity didn't need to shout and persuasion didn't need to humiliate. One child's crayon note stood out. You talk like my mom when she's not mad, but real serious. That's how I knew it mattered. By evening, her floor was covered with thank yous, questions, confessions, and confusions. All sacred. She looked out the window. The Capitol dome still glowed, as it always did at this hour, but it felt quieter tonight, like maybe even the building had heard. She took one more message from the stack, this one from a father in New Jersey. My daughter asked me what fairness looks like. I showed her your clip. She didn't speak after, just nodded. That was enough. AOC tucked that one in her bag. She wanted to keep it close. Justice, she realized, doesn't always wear robes. Sometimes it arrives in ink and paper, in 8-year-old's handwriting, in the quiet breath before a thank you. And tonight, as she gathered the letters, she knew. The mic had been turned off days ago, but the message was still traveling. The page in her journal was unlined, blank except for a single sentence written at the center. They asked why I didn't shout. I answered with the silence that followed. It was the kind of line she didn't plan. It arrived, like clarity after conflict, like breath after resistance. She closed the notebook slowly, as if sealing something sacred. Outside, the noise of the world returned. Cars, headlines, schedules. But inside, there was a stillness she had earned, not by overpowering someone else's voice, but by refusing to raise her own unnecessarily. Miles away, in a high school social studies class, a teacher rewound the clip for the third time. Not for the confrontation, but for what happened after it, for the shift in air, for the room that realized justice didn't need volume. On the board in thick blue marker, she had written a quote from the exchange. Below it, she added a line of her own. Power doesn't always look like thunder. Sometimes it's the calm that makes thunder listen. The students didn't clap. They didn't cheer. But they stayed quiet longer than usual. And in that quiet, a new kind of legacy began to take root. This story reminds us that true power isn't always loud. It's in the quiet courage to speak with purpose, not pride. AOC didn't win by overpowering. She won by unveiling truth with grace. In a world addicted to outrage, this was a master class in restraint. Her silence echoed louder than any argument. What about you? Have you ever witnessed a moment where calm changed the room more than anger could? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.